Well, I guess my job's kind of put things on a statewide scale, and then Alan and Pete and others can get into some of the details here at the local scene. We spent a lot of time in Wichita here lately. I, too, along with Karma, participated in some of the chamber discussions on Wichita's water supply, and much of the information I'm going to give you on the front half of my presentation was is excerpts from a report we gave the Kansas Water Authority back in 2012, which was called our Reservoir Roadmap for the Lower Ark and Walnut Basins. So it's got kind of a surface water orientation. I'm going to kind of leave the groundwater to Alan. I'm sure he'll probably talk a little bit about Wichita's water supply and the role that the Equus aquifer plays in that regard. In addition to having Karma here on the Water Authority, we also have a couple of others. M.S. Mitchell, I see, is here with us. He's on the Water Authority, as is Ray Flickner, who represents Groundwater Management Districts 2 and 5. So we've got good representation from our board that works on these issues in Topeka. Just to give you a little geographical setting, I'm sure the audience has seen these. Many faces in the crowd have heard my spiel many times and could probably give it as good or better than I. But I'm going to focus on the Lower Ark and the Walnut River basins. We've got quite a menagerie of water supply systems in the basins, and you can see a lot of arrows going out of Wichita and some arrows going out of El Dorado. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot about those two communities and the water resources that they have at their disposal and how those meet the needs of the region. You can see there's other interconnections, and that's one of the things that we really heard loud and clear on our Water Vision tour was the ability for public water supply systems to work together. We try to encourage regionalization at the state level with funding, and try to encourage particularly smaller communities to interact and share water resources and share the cost and the treatment facilities and try to keep water affordable. You'll probably again hear about regionalization and interactions between larger communities in a little bit, and I'll just leave it at that. We do have a few reservoirs in the basins. Cheney and El Dorado are the most prominent. We have some smaller municipal lakes that also serve the needs of the smaller communities such as Winfield and Augusta. Wellington City Lake's interesting that was a multi-purpose small lakes project that was funded back in the early 90s. Wellington had, for anybody from the Wellington area here this morning, if you're familiar with the area, they had a lake that was filling up with sediment, and they applied to the state to build a lake immediately below the existing one. For their water supply, and I think the genius in that is they use their old lake as kind of a sediment trap for the new lake. And I think the thing that's interesting about that project, it's one of the only ones that was built in this region for municipal water supply from the Small Lakes Program. And I think that's really an undertapped resource is promoting additional surface water impoundments in the region using more of a smaller footprint than some of the larger ones like you would see at Cheney and El Dorado. I think easier to do these days, more affordable, but yet you get less water, but by the same token, less costs and less headaches to build one. So, and you know, I'll talk a little bit later about some ideas down in Barber County even about some interest in building a new reservoir. Not so much for water supply, but more for recreation and economic development. A little bit on demand, and we've got folks in here that probably can fine-tune these numbers. They were done a few years ago, but if you look at kind of some of the city water demand now or in 2010 and what the high and low projections are in the future, you can see you know, Wellington's fairly level, Augusta somewhat level. You do see some projected growth in El Dorado, and Herb and Kurt are here in the back, and they can certainly provide much more detail than I on this. But you can see El Dorado's demand is projected to exceed 10 million gallons a day out to the year 2050. And again, I'm not going to steal Alan's thunder and any discussions we might have about El Dorado Lake and its possibilities to be a part of the Wichita water supply plan. Wichita's demand, again, Alan can fine-tune these, but back in 2010, you can see that the demands are projected to increase rather, you know, not double, but nearly double from 2010 to 2050. And again, these numbers were done by our office as part of a, statewide project looking at regional water supply and demand. Here's something that we pay a lot of attention to, and that's reservoir yield. Now, you can build a reservoir and have it hold an X amount of water, but it really relies on its ability to refill, and we call that yield. That's water that you receive into the lake, and you got to look at different climatic scenarios. Of course, we've seen all extremes here, and that goes into computing what our average reservoir yield would look like. And that's how we plan. How much can we rely on a reservoir is based on how good its ability to refill is. So you can see on a 2% chance yield, and we may talk about 2%, 1% chance yield, that's basically what drought severity are you going to plan to? We try to look at worst case scenario, and what we do at the state level is we look at 2% drought, and most communities do. What that really means is it's a 1 in 50 year drought. What's the chances of that drought occurring is 1 in 50. And the closest thing we have historically to that is the years 1952 to 1957. If any of you are old enough to remember that drought, that's really the drought of record that we plan to. We try to make sure whatever we're doing that we can meet our needs in a 50 style drought. And so that's what 2% means to us. And so when we look at yield, we say what's Cheney and El Dorado and Winfield's capability of what's their yield in that scenario. And so that's what these numbers represent. And those are represented in million gallons per day. The other culprit that we're battling at the state level, but quite frankly, it's not so bad with the reservoirs in this part of the state, is capacity loss to sedimentation. As you can see going across the board here, our worst is Santa Fe Lake, which was an old railroad water supply lake built way back in the day. It suffered some sedimentation, but still in the 22%, 23% range, which is rather low for a lake of that age. You look at Cheney and El Dorado, very good shape, really, from a standpoint of lost capacity to sedimentation. Wichita's done a very nice job working in the watershed. The characteristics of the Nenasko River make it such that Cheney just doesn't accumulate a whole lot of sediment, and that's a good thing. Sediment yield is another thing we look at is, okay, we want to calculate how much water are we getting into our lake on a given year. We also want to know how much sediment is coming in. 95% of our sediment comes in the highest 5% of the rainfall events. So garden variety rainfall events don't do much harm to our lakes. It's those great big rainfall events like the one that filled Cheney last summer probably brought in a pretty good chunk of sediment into Cheney. I don't think we've gone back and calculated to see what actually came in, but that's when we typically get that accumulation in our reservoirs in those big, what I call toad stranglers. That's a term that I learned growing up from my dad and grandfather, that those are big rains. And so I use that term loosely, and a lot of people look at me like they don't know what I'm talking about. But it's those very excessive rainfall events that mean toad strangler. So if you don't remember anything else, go home, and if you didn't know what a toad strangler is, you do now. One of the things we also are focusing on at the state level, and not so much in this neck of the woods, is restoring our reservoirs. And there's a variety of things you can do to restore your lake. You can dredge it, which we are trying to put together the final plans to do some dredging at John Redmond, which is the backup water supply for Wolf Creek Nuclear Power Plant, which is a source of energy for the Wichita area. We reallocate storage, which means we work with the federal government at all federal lakes to say we'd like to shift a certain amount of water from flood control to water supply and raise the pool level. That's an inexpensive, relatively inexpensive process if you've got the room within the flood control storage to do that. Not all of them, that's a good solution, but it was at John Redmond. We were able to raise the lake 2 feet permanently and pick up about 20 years of additional water supply in a drought. So that was almost a freebie. It took us 16 years to do it, but it didn't cost us anything. And so we look for those opportunities. One thing we have not done in Kansas, but we probably will look at seriously, is actually physically raising the height of the dam in some cases to try to gain additional storage. Why? Well, we already have a footprint there. We have the property acquired for the most case. If you raise the dam, you're probably going to have to acquire a little more, but certainly won't have the environmental impact and the private property rights issues to deal with if you were looking at a simple dam height increase. And then structural restoration. That's something Augusta's doing right now at their lake. They've gone through and repaired their dam to make sure as it's aged that it's capable of storing water safely and meet the water supply needs for Augusta. So those are some of the options we're looking at restoration. We're trying dredging on for size at John Redmond and have already done some of the reallocation stuff. So that's something that may or may not fit into the equation down in this part of the state. Water conservation. You know, at the end of the day, that's the only thing perhaps you have at your disposal is to curb demand. When you get into a drought, you may not be able to increase those supplies and have the infrastructure at the ready to take advantage of these heavy flows, so you've got them for drought times. You have to come up with creative conservation techniques. And again, I'm kind of setting the stage for you, Alan. I know you guys have spent a lot of time talking not only about potential new supplies, but how can we make conservation fit into the equation for Wichita. One thing that we try to focus on at the state level in our rural systems primarily is water loss. We see a significant amount of water loss in our small systems, and we actually contract with the Rural Water Association to go out and actually do leak detection, find out where it's at, and give the local water treatment plant and the infrastructure folks at the city level some tools to go out and fix those leaks, because I can't remember the numbers, but it's in the millions and millions of gallons of water that we actually fix each year through rural water just by finding leaks and fixing them. Another thing that we've kind of tried to transition to and have encouraged our communities to do is do a conservation plan that has drought triggers. So you don't get into a drought and all of a sudden you do this oh heck moment that we got to do something now and get very reactive. You've got to know your water supply and know when you get to a certain level, this is the time to take action and be proactive about it. We hope we do these things for naught. We get into these conservation plans and then Mother Nature bails us out eventually. But the thing that we've done at a number of our reservoirs, particularly with our water assurance districts, is look at our reservoir levels and say, when we reach a certain level, we're going to start conservation before it's too late, and start curbing some of our usage where we can economically. Most of that's outside watering is where communities can make the biggest difference. Certainly we don't have a lot of irrigation going on out of our reservoirs. We do at one of our lakes that we have some storage in, but by and large it's municipal and industrial conservation that we're talking about. Another thing that we have really focused on is getting above these lakes and try to do watershed management. At Redmond, where we're dredging, we're also have an aggressive protection program where we're fixing a lot of erosive stream banks and trying to slow down the rate of sediment coming into the lake. And we think we can cut the sediment rate by about 40% with doing about 150 or 60 stream bank projects above John Redmond. The other thing that we have is we've had in the years past a very aggressive flood control program in Kansas with watershed districts above some of our lakes, and we have some above El Dorado that are functioning. We have about 80 watershed districts in the eastern half of the state that have general plans to do flood control. Well, what do we get with flood control? We get sediment storage. So we get better water quality in our downstream reservoirs because we have the ability to collect water upstream. And so that's something that we looked at very closely in this roadmap was, where do we have watershed opportunities? Where can we build some additional infrastructure up in the watershed and get those benefits down at the reservoirs that provide municipal water supply? Another thing that's probably on the horizon, I talked a little bit about new reservoirs, and particularly the folks in Barber County that are interested in perhaps looking at a smaller site, is there were a number of lakes that the federal government planned over the years that were never built. And that graphic does us absolutely no good at all. But those, you see a number of blue dots out there? Those are lakes that, some of the smaller ones are ones that we did not build. We have 24 federal reservoirs, but there were probably 3 times that planned. Many of them deauthorized by Congress. Ones in this area of the state, there were some, I believe up around Towanda there was one plan. There was one at Douglas, which has been looked at a number of times since it's been deauthorized. Some folks have said, hey, what about that lake? What would it take to build that? And so there's been some planning done. Even after the Corps of Engineers had the lake deauthorized, some of the communities have hired engineers and went in and taken a look at it. Say, what kind of yield can we get out of that lake? How many acres will it impact? What kind of environmental concerns do we have if we were to build a lake? So there's been some pecking around at that, and nothing too seriously yet. But again, those lakes exist. They were looked at. They had some feasibility back in the day. And, you know, you might think you can build a lake anywhere. Well, you can't. You've got to have the right physical characteristics to get that storage and yield. You want a geographic setting that allows for a deep reservoir because you don't want to lose evaporation, water to evaporation from a shallow lake. So, you know, there's a lot of site characteristics that go into that. And these large lakes, there's a limited number of places in Kansas where one of those actually fits. And that's what this list of deauthorized lakes really do for us, is it gives us some sense of where we might look at a new reservoir down the road. So that's kind of the quick and dirty supply and demand and a little overview of some things that we're looking at relative to water supply, not only in this region, but statewide. What I'm going to do next is kind of transition a little bit into the governor's 50-year plan that we're working on right now. And many of you were at the public meeting in Wichita last week. It was last Monday. And so I thought, for those of you that heard this, please indulge me for a little bit. I'm going to kind of do, I'm getting ahead of myself here. I'm not quite ready. I wanted to shift gears and go to the Walnut Basin just a little bit and talk to you a little bit about some of the water supplies over in the Walnut. Let's talk a little bit about water use types. You can see this was 06 water use, and you see Sedgwick County is by and large the largest county as far as water supply in the state, and mostly that is municipal. One thing I wanted to tell you, and if I would have thought about it before I sent these slides to James last night, I would have put this basin and the lower arc in the statewide setting, but I'm going to do it to you numerically. In 2011, we used 4.8 million acre feet of water. In the lower arc and the Walnut Basin, we used 850,000 acre feet out of that 4.8. I think that calculates to just under 18% of the state water use is in these two basins. And then you can see how it compares within the basin itself. So just remember that 4.8 million acre feet of water used in 2011 and 850,000 of it right here where we're at today. Here's the water suppliers over in the lower arc. Again, we showed you that graphic earlier, how some of the systems are interconnected. Here's the lower arc water use type. You start picking up a lot of irrigation, predominantly from the Equus beds and a little bit from the Big Bend aquifer. So you can see a lot more blue in these graphics. That shows you that the irrigation usage picks up as you go west, and it dominates the water use in the lower arc basin. A little bit more about sedimentation. This graphic is kind of tough to see, but what I wanted to point out to you is go clear to the right-hand column and see how much acre feet of storage we lose every year to sedimentation. El Dorado, 355 acre feet of storage is lost to sedimentation each year. Compare that to Cheney, 214. So your bigger reservoirs, those are very good numbers, really, generally speaking. We see Tuttle Creek loses about 1,100 acre feet of storage to sedimentation every year, and that, you know where that's at, up in Riley County. We have 33 public water supply lakes in the two basins, or in the Walnut Basin, that meet our needs. I mentioned a few of them earlier. Looking at population, Butler County, at least between 2000 and 2010, increased by 11%. Cowley County was up slightly, and these are Walnut Basin numbers. Lower Arc Basin, again, you look at the 2010 census, estimated of 730,000 people in 2010. And 640,000 in 2000. So you're looking at about a 13% increase in that decade. While we're looking at an increase in population, we're seeing a decrease in water supplies. Even it's slightly decreasing at Cheney and a little bit in the Equus beds. Population increases, but we're also seeing some declines in our water supplies. Again, just another way of showing you this graphic in terms of acre foot. You can see that the Winfield Lake has lost a little bit from capacity, but then again, you think about Winfield Lake having a natural grass watershed predominantly. The sedimentation loss at Winfield's rather small. Here's looking at the big boys. You can see what El Dorado has done current to original. We've gone from 164,000 acre feet to just under 155, so still not too bad. And remember the original number I showed you, we were well under 10% accumulated sediment in El Dorado. Cheney's similar. Cheney's a much older reservoir than El Dorado. So now I'm ready to switch to the vision for the future of water in Kansas. These are the slides that you saw last week if you were at the meeting. Again, Governor Brownback led this charge for us back in October at his conference and asked us to go out and talk to Kansans and develop a strategy for a 50-year water plan, and that's what we're working on right now. The preliminary draft is out. I do have copies with me. If anybody would like a copy of it, I'm going to make sure though there's a stack of those on the back table when you leave today. Again, this kind of gets you in the setting. If we don't take any action in 50 years, looking statewide, the Ogallala is 70% depleted. We lose 40% of our irrigated acreage in 50 years if we don't do anything with the Ogallala. Our reservoirs 40% filled with sediment in 50 years. 5 of our reservoirs are already at 50%. John Redmond, the one I talked about previously, is one of those. So the document's out online at our website, and again, I'll have copies for you at the back of the table. Here was our draft vision that we shared last week at these meetings. Basically, we're going to commit ourselves in this vision to make sure we have an adequate water supply to meet our social, economic, and natural resource needs and be able to provide for long-term opportunities and statewide economic growth. That's the thing that the governor specifically wanted us to do, is try to come up with a water plan that recognizes our economic growth opportunities and make sure we have water to do that. The mission is really just providing that framework to do that, to implement that vision. One of the things that got a lot of discussion last week was the goals. And we really didn't put a specific goal in the document. We put some choices in there. I think the one that's interesting for this part of the state, and this really came from the Groundwater Management District Board, they sent us a letter and said, our goal is to have a sustainable aquifer. And I think that's a desirable goal. I think our local leadership that manages the aquifer said it best. So we said, why don't we put it in a 50-year vision that the equus beds should be sustainable? What do we have to do to meet that? And so if everybody believes in that goal, then I think we're already kind of working on it. We have computer models and we're going to update. The model's already been updated. We're going to look at some scenarios. What would we have to do to make sure that the equus beds is a sustainable water resource for the region? Out west, where the Ogallala is not sustainable, no matter what we would do, we'd have to curtail pumping so much out there that it would be economic disaster for the region and the state to curtail it to sustainable levels. But what can we do to extend the life? That's been the water policy of the state of Kansas for the last, close to 15 years, has been conserve and extend. What can we do to stretch the life of the aquifer out? And so that's the thing that we're, the banner with folks out west is, what should the number be? How should we approach this? We have some smaller examples in Sheridan County and in Groundwater Management District number 1 where they've proposed some 20% reductions on themselves, regulated themselves to curtail irrigation and extend the useful life of their aquifer. So I think the goal is going to be widely discussed, not only last week, but in future discussions for the rest of the summer to try to define what that number should be in the vision. One thing we heard loud and clear, that there should be multiple numbers. We want sustainability in the equus beds. We know we can't achieve that economically in the Ogallala. So that gives you one good example of the need for having multiple goals that we're shooting for. 4 major categories were looked at into this vision document. Water conservation was one. The big thing on conservation was education. Not only at the school level, but adult education. We heard that loud and clear across the state. And then practices that reduce water supply loss. I talked about the sedimentation practices above our reservoirs. Again, that goes into the conservation category. The other thing we find out is a lot of times we put state policies in place that penalize people that were conserving to begin with. And so we have to make darn sure that we don't create some policy to incentivize conservation, but then penalize somebody that's already been doing it. And I think we've been guilty of that, not only at the state level, but at the federal level. We have federal farm policy that doesn't really bid well for somebody that's being a good steward of the water resource. Water management, a lot of it is related to reservoir management, working with the Corps of Engineers to make smart decisions on when we release water. I think Cheney's a good example of a smart water management decision that the city has worked on with the Corps and said, when we have a little water in the flood pool, don't let it out if you don't have to. If the flood risk is low, leave it in the lake. Let's take advantage of it. Let's rest the equus beds and use flood water. That's a good sound management decision that we need to replicate over and over again. Regionalization I mentioned in my comments earlier. Some have suggested we need to get into the Water Appropriation Act, which is kind of a sacred cow in water circles because it's what the foundation of our water use and much of our water economy is built on, is a system of water rights. But does priority, which is the way it's built, first in time, first in right, gets the water? Does that make sense in an unsustainable aquifer like the Ogallala? If you have a vested or senior water right, you probably think you darn right it means something. If you have a junior water right, it's like, I don't really care about seniority all that much. Economically, K-State tells us that if we're going to make a reduction in the Ogallala, the best way to do it and harm the economy the least is have everybody share in the reduction. Let's don't go through a system of shutting off juniors until you satisfy the senior approach, because there's too much collateral damage economically by shutting off a lot of water rights to make sure one is whole. And so that's kind of fundamentally the difference, is you're cutting off a lot of water users to make sure one survives, or do you make systemic cuts on a smaller scale and have less regional economic damage? So that's one of the things that gets discussed. Frankly, I think that one's probably a little too hot to get a consensus on. But there's some other things, such as the way water rights are perfected. If you apply for a water right in Kansas today, you have to go out and perfect it. You have to go prove to the state of Kansas how much you actually need in that water right. So what do? We go out and pump the heck out of that thing in the perfection period, so we get a very large number. So we've got a little safety net there, probably more than we need year in and year out. So it's been suggested that maybe we look at more average uses as a way of perfecting a water right, rather than leaving it to the discretion of the applicant to go out and perhaps abuse the system. So that's something else that was looked at. Another thing that's common out west is moving water great distances to go find better water in the Ogallala. It was proposed in the draft vision is to limit that to 300 feet, because the problem is if you've got a water right that's in a pocket where the declines have been excessive, they can move it now about a half a mile and maybe find better water, but they also might move into somebody else's water supply. And so that creates more likelihood of having impairment or having administration issues between water users or conflicts. And so one idea is to limit that, which might limit the conflict and limit some of those problems. The other thing that has come up, and it was discussed at the REAP conference in May, was, are our state agencies structured properly? When you look at all the folks that help manage water in Kansas, there's about 5 of us, 5 agencies that have a role in that. And they had a panel discussion at the REAP conference about which way is the best. Should we have one big agency in Kansas, or should we leave it alone, or should we modify it somewhere in between? So that's a kind of an open question too right now on how we should approach that in this 50-year vision. Technology and crop varieties. Technology is all about irrigation efficiency and making sure that you're not turning on the irrigation system when you've got moisture in the soil. And when you do turn on the irrigation system, you aren't losing anything to evaporation, and you're using as little as possible. You're placing that water as close to the plant as you can. And so that's kind of the name of the game in irrigation technologies. Trying to find those better crops. Grain sorghum always gets discussed as a good replacement to corn in terms of meeting our feed needs out west, but using about half the water. The trouble is grain sorghum has not received the research dollars that corn has over the years. And so it's really not a desirable crop. It's not as profitable as a crop right now. And so it's really not an economic option. Cotton is a good option for water reduction, but it's got problems with competing with herbicide drift from cornfields. 2,4-D is a common herbicide applied on corn. If it drifts across the road, it kills the cotton crop rather easily. So folks don't plant cotton because of the risk of having it die because the neighbor spraying 2,4-D. So working on some solutions to that. We heard something on the trail about wheat. We didn't talk much about increasing our wheat acreages as a water conservation device, but we heard that most of our wheat genetics are being done for milling quality, for bread, for baking, for flour. But if we wanted to use wheat as a feedstuff in the feed yards and the dairies, there's some genetic opportunities that could allow us to increase our wheat yields and probably compete very good with corn as far as the producer's concerned. So I think there's some work we can do on wheat as well. New sources of supply, we pretty much touched on this already. I think I laid out the gamut of options. One I did not talk about is transferring water. There's been some discussion about taking high flow water off the Missouri River and putting it in a pipe or a canal and taking it west. And we're actually studying it right now in Topeka. We're looking at an old Corps of Engineers study from 1982 that would take high flow water when we have plenty, which we frequently do on the Missouri River, and piping it west, piping it uphill. Very costly, lots of issues with that. But again, the Missouri River is an underutilized resource in Kansas, and we need to figure out a way to help have the Missouri River meet some of our statewide water needs. There may be other transfer opportunities as well. Really the ASR concept is harvesting high flow water and storing it in the aqueous beds. It's the same concept, it's just not transporting it very far. But the concept is the same. It's taking advantage of high flow water when you have it and using it in our state. That's the long and short of it. How many times have we gone to a meeting where we said we don't want that water to go to the Gulf of Mexico and nobody benefits from it? So that's kind of the fundamental thing behind the idea of looking at transfers. There's a transfer that will probably occur here in the near term, or at least proposed to take place in the near term, and that's City of Hays is proposing to transfer water from Edwards County up to Ellis County using some groundwater along the Ark River that they have purchased a ranch, and their objective would be to pipe that water to Hays and use it to meet their municipal industrial needs in the Hays area. So transfers, I think, is a pretty big deal and something we're looking at it as a new source of supply. Another thing I didn't touch on is lower quality water. We have a lot of salty water. We have produced water coming up with the oil and gas production that probably we're overlooking. And I think technology's coming our way where maybe we can affordably look at that. We've actually got some Wichita oil men looking at that right now, at the possibility of bringing produced water up, running it through a treatment plant, and at least using it back in production in oil and gas. But potentially, can we clean it up enough economically to use it in some irrigation settings? So those are some future things that we want to work on in this vision document. Next steps on that is we'll continue to meet with groups like the Policy Institute, REAP, and others between now and the fall. We're going to improve our document and unveil another draft at the fall Governor's Conference in Manhattan on November 12 and 13. So that's kind of where that's all going. And I think I'll stop there, James.